The sound that morning didn't just echo through our neighborhood. It rattled something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The kind of metallic crash that makes you stop whatever you're doing, because your brain already knows something is wrong before your eyes confirm it. I walked out the front door with a coffee mug still in my hand and froze halfway down the porch steps. My dad, Richard Carter, stood in front of our detached garage with his arms folded so calmly and almost looked rehearsed, while three enormous maintenance trucks sat trapped behind the closed garage door. Standing 20 feet away, screaming into her phone like the entire county worked for her, was Melissa Vaughn, president of the Brookstone Pines Homeowners Association. If you'd asked anyone in our subdivision who really ran the neighborhood, nobody would have said the board. They would have said Melissa. She had a way of making every conversation sound like a courtroom, every disagreement sound like a felony, and every homeowner feel like they were borrowing permission to live in their own house. My father wasn't built that way. He had spent 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, survived deployments, floods, hurricanes, and more government bureaucracy than most people could imagine. After retirement, he wanted tomatoes, woodworking, and quiet mornings. He never wanted a war with an HOA. Unfortunately, Melissa seemed determined to recruit him into one. The funny thing is, people always imagine these stories beginning with one huge explosive argument. Ours started with tiny cuts, a warning letter because our mailbox paint wasn't the exact approved shade, a violation because Dad left his fishing boat in the driveway overnight after a family trip, another because Mom's flower bed supposedly contained non-approved decorative stone. At first, Dad laughed every one of them off. "Son," he'd tell me while dropping another violation notice into the recycling bin, "some folks need hobbies." But then the letters became inspections. The inspections became photographs. Then came strangers walking across people's yards pretending to inspect drainage while quietly taking pictures through windows. Every few weeks, another neighbor would complain that someone had been snooping around after dark. Packages disappeared. Motion lights mysteriously stopped working. Everyone suspected everyone else because nobody imagined the HOA itself could be responsible. Melissa loved calling emergency board meetings where she'd stand in front of a projector wearing expensive business suits and speak about protecting community standards as if she were defending national security instead of arguing about lawn edging. She had supporters too, mostly people who believed strict rules kept property values high. Others simply didn't want to become her next target. Fear is surprisingly effective when wrapped in legal language. Then came the morning. Everything finally broke. Dad had left early to grab lumber for a shelving project. When he came home, he found our garage door wide open and 3 HOA trucks parked completely inside without permission. Workers were unloading equipment while Melissa waved a clipboard around like she owned the building. Dad walked up and asked one simple question: "Who gave you permission to enter my garage?" Melissa barely looked at him. "Temporary municipal authority," she answered. "The board has approved emergency storage operations." Dad tilted his head slightly, the way he always did when someone said something they clearly couldn't prove. "Municipal authority from who?" She flipped through blank-looking papers before pointing to a page so quickly nobody could actually read it. "That's confidential HOA business." Dad smiled. Not an angry smile, almost amused. "Well, Melissa, this garage isn't confidential. It's private property." She laughed. "You don't understand how community governance works." Dad nodded once, stepped back outside, pressed the wall button, watched the garage door slowly lower until it sealed shut behind those 3 trucks, locked the side entrance with his key, then pulled out his phone. Melissa's expression changed faster than I've ever seen someone's confidence disappear. "What are you doing?" she yelled. Dad answered without raising his voice. "Reporting unauthorized entry onto private property." She walked toward him. "You can't trap HOA assets." Dad looked directly at her. "I didn't trap anything. You parked your vehicles inside someone else's building." By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, nearly every neighbor on our street had wandered outside pretending to check the mail or walk their dogs while secretly watching the show. Melissa paced back and forth, insisting Dad had illegally seized association equipment. Dad calmly handed the deputies copies of the property survey, security camera footage showing the trucks entering while he was gone, and photos proving there had been no emergency whatsoever. One deputy looked at Melissa and asked the question that changed everything. "Ma'am, why exactly were your vehicles inside this man's garage?" She started talking fast, throwing around words like emergency ordinance, temporary access, implied authority, community preservation, but none of it answered the question. Then another deputy asked if anyone objected to opening the trucks as part of documenting the scene. That's when I noticed something that still gives me chills. Melissa didn't care whether the garage stayed locked anymore. Suddenly all she cared about was making sure nobody looked inside those trucks. And that was the exact moment my father quietly looked over at me and whispered, "Son, I think we just stumbled onto something a whole lot bigger than parking." The deputies exchanged one of those silent looks cops seem to master after years on the job. The kind where nobody says anything but everyone suddenly understands the conversation has changed. Up until that moment, this looked like a simple property dispute between an irritated homeowner and an overbearing HOA president. Then Melissa practically threw herself between the nearest deputy and the first truck door. "There's association property in there," she snapped. "Confidential records. You don't have authorization." Dad didn't interrupt her. He simply stood beside me with his hands resting in his pockets, watching her unravel one sentence at a time. The deputy remained surprisingly polite. "Ma'am, if these vehicles entered private property without permission and we're documenting the circumstances, we'll need to inventory what's inside." Melissa's confidence began cracking around the edges. "I'll have my attorney here in 15 minutes. The deputy nodded. "You're welcome to call whoever you'd like." Watching Melissa lose control felt strange because for years nobody had ever challenged her. She was the person who challenged everyone else. She fined retirees over garden flags, threatened young families over basketball hoops, and once forced an elderly widow to repaint her front door because the blue was supposedly 3 shades outside the approved color chart. People didn't argue with Melissa because arguing only made things worse. My father, though, had spent most of his adult life dealing with people who confused authority with power, and he recognized the difference immediately. "Funny thing about bullies," he whispered to me while the deputies prepared to open the first truck. "They usually panic the moment someone asks for paperwork instead of permission." One of the deputies unlocked the rear cargo door. It rolled upward with a loud metallic rattle, and for a few seconds nobody spoke. This certainly wasn't landscaping equipment. Shelves lined both walls. Plastic storage bins had handwritten labels. Heavy-duty batteries powered charging stations. There were laptops, hard drives, wireless transmitters, camera mounts, binoculars, portable drones, dozens of SD cards neatly organized inside waterproof cases, and several decorative birdhouses that looked oddly heavier than birdhouses should. The deputy picked one up, examined the bottom, and unscrewed a hidden compartment. Inside sat a miniature high-definition camera with a long-life battery pack. "Well," he muttered quietly, "that's interesting." My stomach dropped. Melissa immediately stepped forward. "Those are wildlife observation devices." Even she didn't sound convinced. Dad finally spoke. "Funny, I don't remember seeing many bald eagles nesting next to people's bedroom windows." Several neighbors chuckled nervously, but nobody laughed for long because the deputies kept finding more. Fake landscape rocks containing cameras, motion sensors modified with recording equipment, GPS units, printed neighborhood maps covered in handwritten notes. One binder listed addresses beside comments like "Leaves yard at 7:35 a.m., dog walked nightly, garage opens automatically at 6:10, children home after school 3:40. I watched one deputy slowly close the binder before looking directly at Melissa. "Who collected this information?" She swallowed. "Community compliance volunteers." "With homeowner consent?" Silence. The entire street suddenly felt different. Neighbors who had spent years assuming they were imagining things now stared at each other with expressions that mixed anger, embarrassment, and relief. Mrs. Henderson from across the street whispered, "I knew somebody had been watching my backyard." Then another voice answered, "I thought I was losing my mind." Within minutes, people began sharing stories they had never connected before. Missing packages, broken security lights, anonymous complaints filed within hours of private family gatherings. Somebody mentioned mysterious drones flying late at night. Another neighbor recalled seeing unfamiliar trucks parked near the walking trail before sunrise. Every story by itself sounded insignificant. Together, they painted something far darker than petty HOA harassment. Melissa kept insisting everything was legal under association authority, but every explanation seemed to create 3 new questions. Then Deputy Alvarez opened a gray metal lockbox secured beneath one of the shelving units. Melissa actually lunged forward. "Don't touch that." The deputy looked up slowly. "Ma'am, you really need to stop saying things like that." Inside the lockbox sat dozens of file folders organized alphabetically by homeowner last name. My family's folder wasn't thin. It contained printed photographs of our backyard, copies of violation notices, utility records, screenshots from social media, handwritten observations about my father's schedule, and even notes describing when my mother usually left for her volunteer shift at the local animal shelter. I felt cold despite the July heat. Dad quietly flipped through a few pages before handing everything back to the deputy. He never lost his composure, but I recognized that tiny tightening around his jaw. That was how he looked when something genuinely upset him. "Nobody deserves to have their family cataloged like this," he said softly. Melissa tried one last time to regain control. "Community associations maintain records. That's perfectly normal." Dad looked at her. "Records about landscaping? Sure. Records about what time my wife comes home every Tuesday? That's something else." Word spread through Brookstone Pines faster than wildfire. Before long, residents from other streets began walking over. Phones came out. Video started recording. Melissa's board members arrived one after another, each looking more confused than the last. Most genuinely seemed unaware of what had been hidden inside those trucks. One board member, a quiet accountant named Frank Delaney, looked inside the open cargo area and immediately turned pale. He backed away like he'd touched a hot stove. Dad noticed. "Frank, you didn't know?" Frank shook his head almost instantly. "I swear to God, I thought those trucks carried maintenance equipment." Melissa glared at him with such fury I almost expected him to melt on the spot. That single glance told us everything. Whatever operation she'd been running, not even her own board fully understood it. About 30 minutes later, an unmarked county investigator arrived after deputies requested additional assistance. His name was Daniel Mercer, a former cybercrime detective with the County Fraud Division. He spent less than 5 minutes examining the equipment before asking everyone except law enforcement to step back. That wasn't a good sign. He carefully photographed every device, every serial number, every storage drive. Then he looked at Dad. "Mr. Prabhu, Carter, do you have interior security footage showing these vehicles entering your garage?" Dad nodded. "Multiple angles." Mercer smiled faintly. "Good. Don't erase anything," Melissa interrupted. "This is ridiculous. You're treating neighborhood volunteers like criminals." Mercer answered without looking up from the evidence. "Ma'am, neighborhood volunteers don't usually hide surveillance cameras inside decorative birdhouses." That line spread through the crowd almost instantly. People repeated it to one another like they'd just witnessed the first crack in a dam. The more investigators uncovered, the more stories surfaced. A teenage kid admitted he'd once followed one of the maintenance trucks out of curiosity and watched employees swap camera batteries behind the community clubhouse. An elderly veteran remembered seeing Melissa personally installing fake landscaping rocks along the walking trail. A dog walker recalled overhearing workers joke that every house in Brookstone Pines had its own file. Then came the biggest surprise of the afternoon. A maintenance technician named Kyle Benton quietly approached my father while investigators continued cataloging evidence. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "I think I need a lawyer." Dad studied him for a second before answering. "Why?" Kyle glanced toward Melissa to make sure she couldn't hear. "Because I helped install some of those cameras. I thought they were for vandalism complaints. Nobody ever told us they were collecting private information." My father didn't respond immediately. He simply placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder and said something that probably changed that young man's life. "Then today is the day you start telling the truth." Kyle nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes. "If I tell investigators everything, she's going to come after me." Dad looked back toward the deputies loading evidence into secure containers. "Not anymore. She won't." As the sun began dropping behind the trees, county investigators announced they would be obtaining warrants to examine every hard drive recovered from the trucks. Melissa stopped shouting. She stopped threatening lawsuits. She stopped pretending everything was under control. Instead, she stood alone beside the empty cargo bay, staring at years of carefully hidden secrets disappearing into evidence vehicles one box at a time. And I remember realizing something I'd never considered before. Sometimes the loudest person in the room isn't fearless. Sometimes they're simply terrified that one locked door is about to expose everything they've spent years hiding. Over the next 3 weeks, Brookstone Pines stopped feeling like the polished little neighborhood people bragged about online and started feeling like the center of a documentary nobody wanted to star in. County investigators came and went almost daily. More evidence warrants were served. Computers disappeared from the HOA office, and neighbors who had barely spoken to one another for years suddenly gathered on front porches comparing stories that finally made sense. Every new interview uncovered another piece of the puzzle. The hidden cameras hadn't been installed to protect the community at all. They had been feeding information into a private database Melissa controlled, one she used to predict homeowners' routines, build violation cases before they even happened, pressure people she disliked, and quietly intimidate anyone who challenged her authority. Some of the recordings were legal because they captured public areas, but investigators believed others crossed far into places they never should have existed. The county never released every detail publicly, and honestly, maybe that's for the best. Some things are disturbing enough without becoming neighborhood gossip. Kyle, the maintenance technician, kept his promise. He cooperated completely, turned over emails, work orders, and archived messages showing that employees had repeatedly questioned the surveillance program only to be told the board had special legal authority. They hadn't. Frank Delaney resigned from the board before the emergency meeting even began, publicly apologizing to every homeowner for failing to ask harder questions. Then came the meeting everyone had been waiting for. The clubhouse had never held that many people before. Residents filled every chair, lined every wall, and stood outside watching through the windows. Melissa walked in wearing the same confident smile she'd worn for years, but it didn't fool anyone anymore. She opened the meeting by accusing my father of destroying the HOA's reputation. Dad waited until she finished, then calmly stood up carrying nothing more than a small folder. "No, Melissa," he said quietly enough that everyone leaned forward to hear him. "The reputation was already destroyed. We just unlocked the garage door." The room went completely silent. One by one, investigators summarized their findings. Board members admitted what they knew and what they didn't, and several residents described how years of intimidation had affected their families. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of victory. It felt heavier than that. Near the end of the meeting, two sheriff's deputies entered through the rear doors. Melissa looked over her shoulder, then back toward the audience, as if she still believed she could somehow talk her way out of everything. Instead, one deputy politely informed her that additional charges related to unlawful surveillance, evidence tampering, and unauthorized access to private property had been approved. She wasn't dragged away in handcuffs with television drama or shouting matches. She simply lowered her eyes as the deputies escorted her outside. The woman who had spent years making everyone else feel powerless left the building without saying another word. Watching that moment didn't make me happy the way I'd imagined it would. It mostly made me think about how easily ordinary people can surrender little pieces of their freedom when someone wraps control in the language of community standards. A month later, the neighborhood elected an entirely new HOA board. The surveillance equipment was destroyed under court supervision. Transparency policies were adopted. Outside audits became mandatory, and homeowners were finally allowed to review association decisions without jumping through endless hoops. Dad went back to building the shelves he'd been working on before all this started, almost as if nothing extraordinary had happened. One afternoon, I asked him whether he regretted locking those trucks inside the garage, knowing how much chaos followed. He smiled, picked up his coffee, and looked toward the driveway. "Son," he said, "I didn't lock those trucks in. They locked themselves in the moment someone believed the rules only applied to everybody else. Every time I open that garage now, I still remember the sound of that door rolling shut, because none of us realized we weren't trapping 3 trucks. We were trapping years of secrets that had finally run out of places to hide." But here's the question I've never completely answered for myself, and I'd genuinely like to hear what you think. If my father had simply told the trucks to leave instead of locking the garage and calling the sheriff, would exposing the truth have been worth the confrontation? Or should peace in a neighborhood always come before pushing back against someone abusing their power? Let me know where you stand in the comments. Was my dad completely justified, or do you think he crossed a line even if it ultimately uncovered something much bigger? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-world justice stories, and share this with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA or a neighborhood bully who thought they were untouchable. Sometimes the smallest decision changes an entire community forever.